regarding the Pakistani Supreme Court's decision to release Omar Sheikh and the 3 other co-conspirators responsible for the death of Daniel Pearl 19 years ago tomorrow. This obviously hits close to home for us. The Daniel Pearl Education Center was formed 8 months after Danny's murder, with the blessing of his family. Our mission is that of Danny's, creating acceptance of all through journalism, music, and humor. We do not condone violence or revenge. As stated by Judea Pearl, Danny's father, Danny's murder was a crime against humanity, journalism, and the entire core of civilized society. We are not out for revenge, only justice for Danny. We ask all of you to contact your own government officials, congresspeople, senators, and even the President of the United States to urge them to see that everything that can be done will be done to reverse this horrendous turn of events. Thank you. And now on to today's fantastic program. First, I would like to introduce the Rabbi of Temple B'nai Shalom, Rabbi Eric Eisenkramer.
Thank you very much, Andy. And I'd like to thank you, Andy Boyarsky, and the Daniel Pearl Education Center for putting together what I know will be a very important and interesting and meaningful discussion today with Tali Nates. I had a moment to visit with her before we began this morning, and we discussed how it's snowing here and it's 70 degrees in South Africa. So good for you. That was a very, very good, glad you're down there. You know, of course, we're gathered today only a few days after International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which commemorates the liberation of Auschwitz in 1945, 76 years ago. And it's so important that we continue to remember, to hear the stories of survivors, and to ensure that genocide never occurs again in our world, and we take the proper steps to prevent it. So I want to thank Andy and the Daniel Pearl Education Center, and we're really looking forward to hearing from Tali today. Thank you. And everybody stay safe and healthy.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. One piece of housekeeping information before we introduce today's speaker. We will have time for a question-answer period after her talk. If you have any questions, you can type them in on the YouTube comment chats line, or you can text me directly if you have my phone number. And yes, it is 7 hours ahead in Johannesburg. And yes, it is 70 degrees there. And yes, it is snowing in East Brunswick. Wonderful. And now I would like to introduce Sheila Sachs, a member of our Daniel Pearl Education Committee, who was instrumental in developing today's program, who will introduce our speaker. Sheila?
Welcome and thank you for joining us today. 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to travel with the International March of the Living, an educational program that brings students and adults from around the world to Poland and Israel to learn about the once thriving Jewish community in Europe and the horrors of the Holocaust. My group consisted of adults from Australia, Canada, South Africa, and the United States. We were most fortunate to have Tali Nates as our guide. She is an historian who has lectured internationally, including at the United Nations, on Holocaust education, genocide prevention, reconciliation, and human rights. Tali is a fellow of both the Salzburg Global Seminar and the first Summer Academy of the International Nuremberg Principles Academy. She is a public, along with her large 3-ring binder, shared her extensive knowledge, insights, and history on the subject of the Holocaust. She enriched my knowledge about the climate that allowed the Holocaust and other genocides to occur, and ultimately allowed me to feel connected to the souls of all those who perished and all that was lost. I will never forget sitting on the steps of the memorial at the site of what had been the Plaszow concentration camp, listening to Tali tell her very personal story of her father and uncle who had been prisoners there and how they survived. Please join me in welcoming one of the most newsworthy and noteworthy women in South Africa, my teacher, my mentor, and most importantly, my friend, Tali Nates, founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for the generous and warm introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be with all of you today, the Daniel Pearl Education Center, and with friends, Andy, Rabbi, and Sheila. Tonight, it is tonight for me. It is raining outside, but it is warm. And I thought that the timing is absolutely perfect because, as a rabbi said just a few days ago, we all around the world thought about the liberation of Auschwitz 76 years ago, but also a day that was declared as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And that was because the liberation of Auschwitz. Yet, when Auschwitz was liberated on the 27th of January 1945 by Soviet forces, don't forget, the camp was almost entirely empty. Those 3 big camps and 40 sub-camps had only around 7,000 to 8,000 prisoners left. All the others were taken on death marches to many, many other camps and suffered for many more months until liberation by Soviet, American, British, or Canadian troops. So what I would like us to do today is to remember that there were many, many, many camps. Auschwitz became a symbol. Auschwitz is known all around the world. But the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum says in their research that there were almost 43,000 camps in occupied Europe and North Africa. So we need to remember more than Auschwitz. We need to remember the Jews were persecuted and were murdered, and many other targeted groups were persecuted and murdered in ghettos, in camps, in killing sites, in killing centers. And for example, what I will share with you today is one of those killing sites and centers that many don't know. And that is where my grandmother and my aunts were murdered. The place is Belzec. It is in the east side of Poland. And between March and December of 1942, 10 months only, almost 500,000 Jews were murdered in Belzec, including my grandmother Leah and my teenaged aunts, Helen and Sila. Why don't we know so much about it? Why do we know so much about Auschwitz? Because Belzec had only one survivor that survived the war, and that is a man by the name of Rudolf Rader that escaped, survived, and told his testimony. So we know very little, but we need to remember Belzec. We need to remember Babi Yar, or Ponar, or Majdanek, Treblinka, Sobibor, Chelmno, or places like Jasenovac or Malit Rostenetz that you probably never heard about, where dozens and dozens of hundreds and thousands were murdered. So today, what I'm going to do is to connect between the Holocaust, my family's history, and also I would love to tell you a little bit about how Story became a memorial and a museum in Johannesburg that I started with a team of fantastic people and share a little bit about what we do, bring Johannesburg to you in a way. So I will do a few things, and what I want to do is to tell you a personal story, and through this personal story, bring you to the issue of memory and the issue of lessons from history. Let me start by sharing my screen and tell you the story of Schindler's List, but also the story of my father, Moses Turner. As you see, this is the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. So how did a family story brought me from Poland to Israel, to South Africa, and to create one of the largest museums of the Holocaust and Genocide in the whole of the African continent? So let's start this story. This is a story of a family, and the family is the Turner family. In the family, you had my grandmother, Leah, and 4 children. Henrik Turner was the eldest. Helen, or Hella Turner, was second. There was 2 years between them. The third was my father, Moses. His Polish name was Marian. And the little one, his sister, was Sila. And Sila was born tragically after my father's father passed away of cancer. So my grandmother Leah had 4 children, young children, 2 years between them, and had to fend for herself with the help of course, extended family, her brother, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and cousins. They lived in Nowy Targ. I brought the map just to show you where Nowy Targ is in the map of Poland. Many of you know where Warsaw was. Warsaw is, Warszawa, where Krakow is. Nowy Targ is in the mountains in the southwest of the country. And it's a beautiful place, very close to the ski resorts of Zakopane. But sadly, on the 1st of September, 1939, the war started, and because of its proximity to the border with what was before the war Czechoslovakia, the Nazis invaded Nowy Targ already on the 1st of September. So my grandmother, that as I said was a widower, and the 4 kids were caught immediately under Nazi control. I put here just for your information and to know the different story of what happened to each one of them. And what I'll do today is to tell you the story, but I will go into some details more and we'll leave some details. And please feel free to ask anything that you want to know more about in the question and answer session. Let me introduce you to Sila and Hella. I'm named after Helen. Helen, my aunt that I never met, that actually I never seen a picture of until these 2 drawings were discovered by family members in the United States. Because nothing existed, nothing survived after the war. And you notice that there is no picture of Leah. I never seen a picture of my grandmother. None survived. These are my aunts. They were 12 and 16 years old when they were murdered in Belzec in August of 1942. And I want to tell you their story and the story of the family. When the Nazis invaded Nowy Targ, the family was separated. My father, who was 14 years old at the time, was taken with a group of about 100 men and boys to his first labor camp. And let me just remind you, as I said to you, my father, Moses Turner, first of all, was deported. This is Stuart Company Zakopane concentration camp. So let's see what happened to the rest of the family. The rest of the family was taken to a ghetto in Novi Targ. And in August of 1942, everyone was called to the football stadium, the soccer stadium of the town. By the way, it's still there. I visited there in 2004 when I took these pictures in one of the many trips that I took to Poland with many, many groups, like the one that Sheila spoke about on the March of the Living. They were taken to this same football stadium, and there the Nazis conducted a selection. Most of the people of the town, about 2,400 of them, were taken to one side. In that side, my grandmother and my aunts, Helen and Sila, were kept. On the other side was a small group. The leaders were taken to the one side. The leaders were part of the Jewish council called the Judenrat. They were taken to one side, kept aside, and then a group of able-bodied men and women, where my uncle Henrik was. The group of the leaders was then marched to the Jewish cemetery, and immediately all of them were shot dead and buried in a mass grave. The small group, including my uncle, was then immediately taken to other concentration camps. And if you noticed, my uncle was taken to few concentration camps, including the Rabka SS school, where the Nazis trained the SS to kill. And I'll tell you more stories about that a bit later. The large group, including my family members, was taken across the road to the Novi Targ train station. Still there, still across the road, when I visited a few times a few years ago. They were then taken with cattle trucks to the Belzhitz killing center or death camp. In 2004, with my mother, with my brother, my father was no longer alive at that time, and my uncle was too sick to travel. We traveled to the opening of the Belzhitz Memorial. And for the first time, I could put a little stone on the name of the town as a mark of the grave, actually, of my grandmother Leah and my two aunts, because there is no grave. They were murdered in the gas chambers of Belzhitz, most probably on the 30th of August, 1942, and the ashes were spread throughout this site. What happened to my uncle? What happened to my father? They did not know. They did not know that the rest of the family was murdered. And by the way, all family members were murdered. There was only one distant cousin that survived. No one else, no grandparents, no uncles, no aunts, no cousins, no one else survived. But my father survived, my uncle survived. How did they survive? So, let me tell you a little bit of the story. My father, as I told you, was taken as one of the first 100 boys' men to Zakopane. Now, this is a story because Zakopane was a ski resort. It still is actually a ski resort. It's a beautiful area. What is really tragic is that for 14 years of my father's life, he used to go on the weekend to Zakopane to ski. But when the Nazis took him and the 100 boys and men to Zakopane, to the Stuart Company concentration camp, he went back to the same place that was a place of pleasure, and he basically worked in a quarry. He had to cut stones and carry stones for this German company, building company. Now, as a young boy, he had terrible experiences there of cruelty, of course, very bad treatment, but I want to share with you just one such story. From carrying the stones, he became, he had hernia, and he was very, very sick. He became very, very sick. To save his life, because untreated, he would have died. So to save his life, a Jewish doctor in the camp did a hernia operation on him without anesthetic, saved his life. His youth helped him. And I remember the huge scar that he had on his tummy, but he saved his life. So this is just to give you a bit of a understanding that even in those little camps that you never heard about, it was many times life and death on a daily basis. My uncle, I told you, was still in the ghetto with his family, but then taken to many different camps. And I told you that I'll tell you about Rabka. Rabka was also about 10 kilometers from home. So again, a town in the area where he was taken to build or help to build the SS school, training school. My uncle's task was to build the practice, the target practice ranges for the SS. And later on, he would testify against one of the criminals there because what he witnessed was how the SS were target practicing on Jews, on human beings. Luckily for him, he was moved from there to another camp and then to another camp. And that's how he got to Plaszow concentration camp, where our story continues. This is Plaszow. Plaszow concentration camp started right next to Krakow. If some of you saw the film Schindler's List, I'm sure that you remember this concentration camp. Plaszow was first a labor camp established in 1943. Many of the Krakow ghetto Jews that were not sent to Belzec or to Auschwitz were sent to Plaszow to work. Men, women, and even children. Plaszow then changed to a concentration camp in 1944, and all the children were taken from the camp. There was a children action or children action where sadly the Nazis fooled their parents, fooled the mothers and fathers, kept them in one side of the camp, played very happy music, and then gathered all the children on trucks and took them all to Auschwitz and murdered them. My uncle arrived in Plaszow in 1943. He worked hard labor as a barrack builder. He built those barracks that you can see in the picture. In 1944, in the beginning of 1944, end of 1943 maybe, he heard rumors that a group of prisoners is being transferred from Zakopane labor camp, the Stug labor camp, to Plaszow. He knew that his brother, my father, was there. And he thought maybe he survived, maybe he will actually be able to see him. He waited, he saw the prisoners disembarking the trucks. He did not see my father by then, I think about 3 years, maybe slightly more. So my father by that stage was 17 or just over 17 years old, but he recognized him. And he ran to him and they hugged. This is actually a very emotional story that always, when my uncle told me about it, he used to cry because he said he saw my father, they hugged, They cried. And my father then asked him what happened to the rest of the family. And Henrik, my uncle, didn't know. You see, they didn't know that they were sent to their death. They just knew about the separation. So he said, we were separated in the football stadium, and I don't know. They were taken somewhere else. I just don't know where. And then they swore never to part. They said, whatever happened, we stay together. So I'm not sure how, but my father managed to get a job as an assistant carpenter or assistant barrack builder. So they could stay together. What you also probably know about Plaszow is that if you watch Schindler's List, is that Plaszow had a very, very cruel, notorious commander. And that commander was Amon Goeth. And Amon Goeth was a very cruel man that was corrupt, loved the power, was a sadist, and was walking around in the camp with a gun, and many times shooting people at will. My uncle, that was the one that spoke, and I'll speak a little bit about it later. My father was the quiet one. My father was the traumatized one. He did not speak much. My uncle spoke, and he said that one time he was building a barrack, and next to him was another prisoner that he knew, someone that was working next to him for a while. And suddenly he heard a shot, and this prisoner next to him just fell dead. And basically he turned around, he looked, and Amon Goeth, the commandant, was walking around with the gun on his shoulder and just, just walking away. My father and uncle had terrible time in the camp. It was not always really easy. One of the times my father went out for forced labor to the fields, and because they swore never to part, because they swore to stay together and to help each other, my father suddenly found potatoes left by a kind Polish farmer, and he collected the potatoes. He hid it on himself, and he tried to smuggle them back to the camp to share with his brother. Sadly, on that day, the Nazis searched and found the potatoes on him, and they made an example of him, and they put him sort of in the center and gave him lashes, 50 lashes on his back, on his head. It was a very, very traumatic experience for him that he always spoke about, and he had nightmares about that and other things until the day he died. One more thing that I want to share with you is that Oskar Schindler at that stage was in that area. Let me tell you a little bit about Oskar Schindler. Again, probably a very known story, but let me tell you a little bit of highlights. Oskar Schindler was from a town, Zwickau, in what used to be Czechoslovakia, but he was German. In 1939, he joined the Nazi Party. He was married to Emily. He was a Roman Catholic. He was an opportunist. Some say he was a spy. There are lots of stories about Oskar Schindler. He arrived in Krakow, took a factory in Krakow that belonged to Jews, had workers working in this factory. It was called the Milia. They did pots and pans and emelway and so on. He had Polish workers, which he paid, and he had Jewish workers, which he did not pay. He had about 400 Jewish workers. It grew to about 600 Jewish workers. When the ghetto in Krakow was formed, the Jewish workers came from the ghetto. when the ghetto was liquidated and those workers were taken to Plaszow concentration camp, he took the workers from Plaszow concentration camp. So to start with, Oskar Schindler, in a way, was a perpetrator. He did not kill anyone. He was a nice guy, but he did not pay salaries. He used forced laborers. He colluded with everyone else around him. And he belonged to the Nazi party. But something happened to him. He watched as the Krakow ghetto was liquidated. He watched and seen the cruelty of those that he called friends that were in the SS. And he started to change. And he started to help. And he helped in many, many ways in the factory. He helped by giving food. He helped by getting people off deportation trains to Auschwitz. He helped by keeping his workers in the factory when he heard that they are going to arrest people and send them to Auschwitz. So he certainly made a choice to change. Now, my father and my uncle now meeting Oskar Schindler only in Plaszow. So they are not in the ghetto, they are in Plaszow, and that's where they hear about Oskar Schindler. That is where they know about Oskar Schindler. And what happens is that the Nazis are starting to lose the war. The Soviets are coming nearer and nearer. And the Nazis want to destroy the evidence of their crime in the camp of Plaszow. There are mass graves in the camp. Many thousands of people were murdered in Plaszow. Probably about 8,000 were murdered of the 30,000 that were there, so almost a third. My father and my uncle are taken as this group of people that have to uncover the graves and burn the bodies. We call that unit Sonderkommando 1005. It was a special commando unit forced by the Nazis to uncover the graves everywhere in Eastern Europe, in many, many places in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in occupied parts of the Soviet Union, Lithuania, and so on. That, again, was a very, very traumatic experience for them. They, yeah, it was, again, I can tell you my father had nightmares until the day he died. I remember as a little girl, him screaming at night about those scenes, those things that he had to do. The Nazis were about to take everyone from Plaszow to Auschwitz and murder. It's the end of 1944, it's September, October of 1944. And that is when Oskar Schindler is making his list. The list is of about 1,100 people. There are sections for men, there are sections for women. We know that children were also on the list. My father and my uncle find themselves on the list on page 10. You can see, I highlighted it in yellow. My father is first, Turner Moses. You see my uncle's name, Turner Henrik. You see the prisoner number. You see the date of birth, and you see the profession. The profession was carpenter or barrack builder and assistant barrack builder or carpenter. They are put on the list because of their professions. They are young, 17 and about 20, 21 years old at that time, 17 and a half. And they are there luckily, and they don't even know until their death. They were not sure how Isaac Stern, that was the accountant of Oskar Schindler, somehow probably asked people around, added people, because don't forget, in the factory, there were only 600 workers. The list was a list of about 1,100. So they could add another 500 and even 600 names to the list. Another thing that is interesting, and I think something important to mention, if you look at the list on top, you will see the name of Gross Rosen. What happened was that the men were taken from Plaszow to the Gross Rosen concentration camp. They were there for a few weeks. Again, they did not know that they would get out of it. Gross Rosen was a very bad concentration camp, one of the notorious ones in the northeastern Poland. And the women were taken to Auschwitz. And again, absolute miracle, and you know it from Schindler's List. In the movie, Steven Spielberg sends Schindler to Auschwitz. In reality, Schindler sent actually one of his mistresses to Auschwitz. But in any case, they went to Auschwitz and they got the woman from Auschwitz to Brunlitz. And they were in Brunlitz from October of 1944 until the liberation in May of 1945. And what I can tell you, and I'll just go back to this picture, is that my father and my uncle at the Brunlitz concentration camp were just talking about the kindness of Emily Schindler, about the kindness of Oskar Schindler. It was the hardest winter of the war, the winter of 1944. There was no food. Somehow they managed to get food to those prisoners. He always told the story about Emily that used to give them cigarettes. You know, they did not smoke, but other prisoners smoked, and she would give them cigarettes. And I heard it from so many of the Schindler survivors about Emily and Oskar Schindler giving cigarettes, and just about the kindness of the two. It was an armament factory, but they did not create any arms. Oskar Schindler bought arms on the black market and gave those arms that he bought on the black market to the Nazis. They worked, but the SS was not allowed inside the camp. They were only guarding the outside. So, as I said, thanks to Oskar Schindler and his list, they were liberated by the Soviet army in May of 1945. My uncle said that it was a woman on a horse that opened the gate of the camp and said to them that they are free. Now the question is where to go from there. This is the first picture I have of my father. I do not have pictures of him as a child, as a baby, as a teenager. Everything was destroyed. The house was actually destroyed. This is my father on the right-hand side. He is with his friends from the list that became family members. I used to call them uncles, you know, because all of them immigrated many years later to Israel. And because I had only one real uncle, they were also my uncles. And you can see that he's still very thin. But then there was the decision what to do. So my uncle decided to go back to Poland and to look for the family members. He went back to Novi Targ. He managed to sell the grounds of the house, only the actual grounds, because the house did not survive, to a neighbor that allowed them to have a little bit of money. But then extremist right-wing Polish nationalists murdered in few pogroms around Poland some of the survivors. And you can see on the right-hand side a memorial to those that were murdered actually in his town, in Novi Targ. Henrik, my uncle, realized that he cannot stay in Poland. So he joined a sort of an underground organization called the Bricha. Bricha in Hebrew means escape. And they were smuggling survivors through the Alps to then in illegal immigration, they sailed to what was then British mandated Palestine. His ship was caught by the British, and my uncle was then deported to Cyprus and was in British camps in Cyprus until the Declaration of Independence of Israel. There is a silver lining because he met his wife in those camps. She was also a survivor, and they got married, and they have my cousin Tzvi, that is named after my grandfather, the dad of cancer, as I told you. My father decided to actually go to a United Nations program that allowed them to go to Germany, to the survivors to go to Germany, because don't forget, he was 14 years old when the war started, had no education, no high school education, no education. So he decided to take this UN program to get educated. So he went to study, and he did a very quick high school and then studied to become a motor mechanic. And when he graduated in 1950, Israel was already established, and he immigrated to join his brother. As I said, they never wanted to part, so they reunited in Israel. And he met my mother. My mother was also from Poland, from Warsaw, and they got married. They had my brother, Amir, my oldest brother, and myself. And sadly, my father died quite young, at the age of 48, from cancer. He was the quiet one. He did not speak. My uncle did speak. My uncle wrote this poem. And the poem was written in the year 2000, about 4 years before he passed away. And I would like to share that poem with you. It tells the story of their survival. My uncle also changed his name from Henrik to Hanoch, which is a Hebrew name. I write this poem for generations to come, with tears in my eyes, when I remember the faces of my dear ones, when they stood on the Appellplatz. They, the barbarians, robbed and beat them. Children were torn from their mothers. They cried, screamed, Shema Israel, but up above, no one heard them. Close to each other they stood, to part they could not, to hug each other with a hearty kiss. The evening got nearer and nearer, but the barbarians shoved and pushed to the transporter, to the labor camps, and to the cattle trucks that moved to the death camps. They cried, screamed, Shema Israel, but up above, no one heard them. We survived the war. We survived the destruction. Thanks to the savior, Oskar Schindler, his list. We returned to Poland, disappointed and broken, not finding our dear Jewish families anyway, visiting the graves of the holy and pure ones that died on Kiddush Hashem. They cried, screamed, Shema Israel, but up above, no one heard them. My uncle was the one that spoke. He wrote a lot of poetry. He wrote his memoir. He was very happy that I was interested. He was the one that spoke because my father was too traumatized to speak. My father had the nightmares, but he did not speak. He spoke a little bit to my mother. He spoke very little to me because I was always the one interested. So I know some of the stories, but I do not know much. My uncle was also the one that was the active one. He went back to Germany to testify in a Nazi war crime. And it was 1965. And he testified in trial of two perpetrators, two Nazi war criminals that were responsible for the deaths in his town of Novi Targ, in Zakopane, and even in the SS school of Rabka. As you can see, one got 4.5 years, the other one got 7 years, and we're out very, very quickly out of jail. My uncle used to say, you know, I just had to testify. Whatever justice was given to them in the courts, it's whatever, it is okay. God will judge them when the day comes. And both of them had a very interesting and complex relationship with God that is really interesting, because they grew up in Hasidic family, in religious family. They lost faith, then they regained faith, and they had all the time this struggle with God. They never went back to Poland, and it took me many, many years to go back to Poland. I only started to go back to Poland in the 1990s, late 1990s. But since then, of course, went many, many times. Actually, in one of my visits back, my uncle, he was 87 years old. It was before he died. He said to me, can you look for a picture of my mother, my grandmother, because I want to say goodbye. I never said goodbye to her. I never said goodbye to my sisters. But there isn't a picture. I couldn't find the pictures. So in a way, I go back, and I went back with Sheila to somehow, you know, say that Kaddish, say that farewell for my uncle. I go with many, many groups. The last time that I went was in June 2019. Of course, in 2020, no one went anywhere. But that was an interesting group, because it was a group from all over Africa, of scholars, of psychologists, of teachers, of professors, from Senegal, from the DRC, from Mozambique, from South Africa. We had a Holocaust survivor with us from Warsaw. She was in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the idea is to try and make those connections. This is Schindler's factory. We also went to Plaszow, telling the story, but also making connections. And the connections are to those life lessons that my father used to tell me as I grew up. He used to talk about the fact that Schindler was a German. He used to say, you cannot generalize. You cannot say all Germans were bad. And he used to say, because of Oskar Schindler, I'm alive. And he used to say to me, because of Schindler, you are alive. He also used to say that people have choices. And of course, Schindler is a very good example of those choices, starting as a perpetrator and moving to an upstander, a rescuer, a person that saved 1,200 men, women, and children. He saved a few more on an abandoned train that was next to the factory and that he released. So that brought me to work in this field as a historian. And you see a picture of my father just before his death. He was a motor mechanic. He was a forgiving man. He was a liberal man, a tolerant man. And you will not believe it, he worked in a Volkswagen garage. And he always said, you know, the children are not guilty. The young Germans of today are not guilty. He was an interesting man. And when in 2012, we started to build the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, to a large extent, I did it in his memory, the memory of my grandmother, the memory of my family. This is the center. It opened officially in March 2019, even though we worked from the center, even though it wasn't finished, from 2016. We did a grand opening in September of 2015 and moved in, and then officially the exhibitions and everything else opened in March 2019. It is a very symbolic building. You see the railway lines, you see the bricks, you see the kind of cattle truck window that is going into our resource center. And I'm very happy to answer questions about the building later. But we have beautiful permanent exhibitions that tell the story of the Holocaust, but tells the story of genocide, from the Herero and Nama genocide in Namibia to the Armenian genocide, to Rwanda, the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda in 1994. It's full of artifacts and music and art and poetry, and it is a very, very different kind of exhibition. It tells stories of Holocaust and genocide survivors that settled in Johannesburg after the war. So, for example, it tells the story of Veronica Phillips, a survivor from Budapest, from the ghetto of Budapest, that had a childhood doll. She gave the doll to her mother to keep in the ghetto. Veronica finally picked up parties. Veronica survived 3 different concentration camps, including Ravensbrück, and a death march, and came back to Budapest to be reunited with the doll. Her father did not return. He died in the camps. He was killed in the camps. And when we opened in 2015, she gave the doll to us for permanent display. And then you see Sylvester Sendakieye, that was 12 years old when he survived the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. Of course, a genocide of 100 days from April to July of 1994, where he lost 7 siblings and his parents in one of the churches. They were murdered, and he and 2 of his brothers miraculously survived. And he speaks about the pair of shoes that are on display in the exhibition, very similar to his childhood shoes. So I want to end and allow us to have a bit of a discussion, but I would like to end with one of the displays in our exhibition, and that is of, again, 2 survivors, Sylvester, that you already met, and another survivor, this wonderful woman, 88-year-old. By the way, Veronica is now 94 years old. She's amazing. She was a biologist, a geneticist, actually, at one of our main universities at Wits. But Irene is another survivor, wonderful survivor from the Warsaw Ghetto. And she said, I thought that when the world learned what had happened to us, it could never happen again, but it did. And you met Sylvester already. You know his story. And he said, and a genocide happened yet again to us here in Rwanda, in full view world. And that is the tragedy, that after the Holocaust, my father, my uncle, all the survivors said, never again. But the never again was never a reality. And sadly, it still is not a reality. And very much it is up to us to make it a reality. And that is something that our center is trying to do. So I will stop here and see if there are any questions. Of course, I can speak for another many hours, as Sheila knows, but I wanted to give you the story and just make a little bit of a connections to the work I do today.
Tali, that was absolutely unbelievable. I almost had to step out of the room when you read the poem. We did have the questions could go on forever, but and your talk was amazing. We did get some questions from the folks, so let me just ask a few for you. Why do you think that it took so long after the war for Schindler's List story to become known, with especially after the Spielberg movie? So the war ended in 1945 and the movie was in 1993. So it's almost 18 years later. Why do you think it took so long?
Such a good question. By the way, I was never asked that question. So thank you for whoever is asking it, because it's an excellent question. It's interesting. I knew about Schindler all my life. So let me tell you an amazing story that maybe many of you don't know. I mean, you know that in the end of Schindler's List, you have the grave of Oscar Schindler in Jerusalem on Mount Zion, and you see all the survivors go to the grave and put the stones. I mean, that you know. What maybe you do not know is that Schindler, look, he never succeeded in anything he did after the war. So during the war, he made a lot of money. Then, you know, the survivors sort of saved his life by getting him away from the Russians and into the American zone. Because if he would have, let's face it, if he would have been caught by the Russians, they would not have asked questions. He was a perpetrator, a head of a concentration camp in Brunlitz. They would have killed him. So they saved him, but it did not end there. They kept in touch with Schindler after the war. So what happened was that Schindler, after the war, decided that he will be a very successful farmer. He will be amazing in farming. So they helped him. They gave him money to settle him and Emily. They never had kids. So him and Emily in Argentina. But he was a failure. He was actually a failure in everything that he did after the war. So he left Emily in Argentina. She died in Argentina. He went back to Germany and he became an insurance salesman. I mean, that is Oscar Schindler, insurance salesman, but never succeeded even in that. And in the end, it was the survivors, and I still have the receipts from my father. They used to collect money, and my father was not a rich man. He worked as a mechanic, you know. He used to save money to give to Schindler to come to Israel. And he would come to Israel every year for about 3 months. And they will party and they will drink because he loved to drink, and they will dance. And I remember as a little girl, I was maybe 7 years old, 8 years old, I would remember my father and my mother, you know, leaving us with a babysitter and going to party with Schindler. So the survivors knew the story. They saw Schindler. By the way, my mother said he was a very good-looking man. I think it's quite funny, you know. Oh, he was a very good-looking man. So, you know, but no one else knew the story until the Australian writer Thomas Keneally went into the shop and heard the story from one of the survivors in LA, and wrote the book Schindler's Ark, and then Steven Spielberg read the book and then did the film. So it's really interesting how, listen, for many of those rescuers, it was not about the fame or to make movies on or books about. I can give you, I mean, there are about 28,000 rescuers. We know the stories of what, 10, 20, 30? So I would say most of them, we don't know the stories, but the stories are absolutely amazing. And I'm very happy that the story became well known. I think it's a good story to know. For education, it's an excellent story to know, because you can see how someone can move from being a perpetrator to being an upstander. And it's really important to understand that you do not have to stay. You have choices throughout life, and you can always do good in the world.
That pretty much answered the next question that we had, which was, you know, what happened to Schindler after the war? Because in the movie, if I remember correctly, he drives away from the camp, and then you don't see anything. That's the end of the movie, and then they go to the cemetery. So that was very interesting how he lived out the rest of his life. You mentioned.
I'll tell you one more thing that maybe will be of interest. There's a survivor in the United States, Gerta Klein. Maybe some of you know the name. Very famous. She spoke a lot about it. When Schindler when Schindler got to the American, you know, they took him to the American to be investigated and interviewed. The husband of Goethe Klein, I mean, later she married Alex Klein, I think it was Alex Klein, that was a Jew that spoke German and English, was the one that interviewed him. So it was quite an interesting, and they settled in the United States. Just interesting how, you know, people sort of knew about Schindler for many years, but the story only came out in 1993.
One of the things that you mentioned and talked about was the absence of a picture from your mom, of your grandmother. I'm sorry, your grandmother. There's a book somebody asked about and talked about called The Lost: A Search for 6 of the 6 million. Did you ever think about that while you were looking? And how do you ever find these pictures all together? It's just an amazing thing when you go to the Holocaust Memorial to see these old pictures and all these artifacts. How do you find these things?
Yeah, it's very tragic of all genocide, by the way. I speak to young survivors that survived Rwanda and they have no pictures of their families. It's one of, in The Lost, Mendelssohn, one of the very powerful quotes is that genocide, and in that case, the Holocaust, is more than the people that were killed. It's the children that will never be born. It's the art that will never be, you know, created. It's the, you know, it's the music that will never be, you know, composed. I'll never forget that because it really got to me, that kind of phrase. And I think it's an amazing book, an amazing research that he did. You know, the archives are amazing, and I actually just put a request to the Bad Arolsen archive, because all the time new archives are opening, and all the time new material is coming forward. And I actually just about a month ago put another request to have another look in the Bad Arolsen archive. Is the largest archive of German documents. 50 kilometers of documents are there in that archive, and it takes them a long time because it's not all digitalized, but they are digitalizing most of the stuff. And I'm still hopeful that one day maybe a photograph will surface. It was a miracle that the pictures of my aunts did surface through distant cousins that immigrated to the United States. Yeah, the tragedy is also that, you know, for most families, there are no pictures. For most families, there will never be actually pictures. And that is another loss. So my father used to say, I have blue eyes and blonde hair. And my father always said, you look like my mother. But I don't know, you know, I cannot. He said, she was tall, she was, you know, very fair. I just don't know.
There you go. We have two other questions. First of all, I get the term, no question about it, the Yiddish word beshert works for this question, because one of our committee members, Ron Brandsdorfer's father, was also at the Plaszow air concentration camp, and his father, so Ron's grandfather, they reunited after the war. Who was in Bergen-Belsen, some miraculous way they got together again. So he wants to know how long did it take. First, you explained that your father was very quiet, as are many Holocaust survivors about their experiences. How long did it take your uncle to open up to you about what happened?
First of all, Ron, wow, I would love to know, you know, your story and to hear more about it. So maybe we can share my email, and you wouldn't mind telling me more about it. I'm always so interested to know more about Plaszow and what he worked in, and how did he, you know, Bergen-Belsen and the reunion and so on. But I just told you a little bit because again, I just couldn't tell you all the story. And as I told you, in a way, my father died youngish, at 48, and and I was still young, and who knows if he didn't if he would not have died so young, and I would have grown up and asked and be a nag, because I was always a young historian. I always wanted to know. Maybe he would have told me, or maybe he would have told my children. Many times it's a third generation that gets the stories from the survivors, but he didn't. So I knew little from him. A little. He did say a little. He started to open up a little bit more to my mother after the Eichmann trial in Israel in the early 1960s. So my mother knew a little bit more, but I was not born, so it was not yet, I didn't know the full stories. My uncle was the one that always was, the fighter one. You can see, from the stories that I told you, he was the one that was smuggling the survivors, from the Alps. He was the one that was talking all the time. So for him, and when you look at survivors, there are the talking survivors and the quiet survivors. He was the talkative one. We have the same in our survivor community here. I'm jumping, but Veronica, that I introduced to you, only started to speak 10 years ago. She's 94 years old. So she started to speak at the age of 84, never spoke about it before. So many of the survivors are like that. My uncle wrote his memoir late in life. When he was frail, he decided he needs to write his memoir. It's not published, but it was for the family. But his poems, he always wrote, his poems. He wrote poems about Cyprus. He wrote poems about the smuggling in the Alps. So I have a lot of poems, but this poem specifically is a very, very powerful, and it's a very, I'm so grateful for him that he wrote this poem, because in a way, it's something that will go from generation to generation. My daughter has it, her kids will have it. And yeah, so he started to speak quite soon, and he spoke also to schools in Israel. One more thing that I can tell you about my uncle is that my brother was not interested, my uncle's son was not interested, I was interested. So he loved the fact that I was interested. So he was always, when I arrived, there's someone interested. So I always heard all the stories, and I'm so lucky that I did, He used to say in Yiddish, Meidele, come sit here, and he would tell me the stories. And he also did a Spielberg Shoah Foundation tape. So I also have my uncle's Shoah Foundation testimony.
That was actually one of the questions. Is his memoir or poems published?
So no, maybe one day when the memoir is short, and it's very much for the family. So it's sort of it wasn't written as high literature, even as some survivors do, which is fantastic. Maybe one day, if I'll, do more than a chapter, if I'll write a book, one day. I wrote many chapters to different books, but maybe one day I will incorporate his memoir, as part of a book, and definitely his poem. So I give the poem always to the groups. Sheila, you heard it. In all the groups that I take to Poland, they hear this poem, and it's a testament in another way.
Sure. One final question. With your unique position in what you do, this is something that you probably think about, I would imagine, fairly commonly. We obviously live in a very complex world with a lot of things going on, which are just almost unimaginable. what would your message be to the world, given your background in Holocaust and genocide education?
Yeah, the world we live in is a difficult world. You started, Andy, with the absolute devastating news from Pakistan. And of course, the world is becoming more intolerant, more extreme. In our work, we work in countries around Africa. We launched programs, education programs, teaching, amongst other things, the Holocaust and genocide in 12 African countries, including Nigeria. And in 2018, I was in the north of Nigeria and worked with the girls, the Chibok girls that were released from Boko Haram captivity. And I can tell you, I mean, the trauma of those girls, there were 121 girls at that time, more were released after that. And that is extremism, religious extremism. You have extremism that is other forms of extremism, if it is a more conservative forms like in some countries in Europe, or other forms of extremism and narrowing nationalism and populism in countries in Asia, South America, and so on. Of course, for a while, there is worry about fragility of democracy for quite a while. It's not only in the last few weeks. So did we learn anything? You wonder, after the Second World War, not only we said never again, but we put set of sort of laws and there was, for example, in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Is there human rights, you know, in places like China where you have genocide of the Uyghurs at the moment? Is there human rights in places like Myanmar where the Rohingya were persecuted? Yeah, so examples I can give from all over the world, but in a way we are regressing, and that is a great worry. For me personally, I am still a true believer in education, and I do believe that, you know, you have to educate, that is one, but you also have to safeguard democracy. You have to support a free media. And of course, with Daniel Pearl is, you know, in our thoughts is the freedom of journalists to cover the stories, and justice system that should be fair and just. So we have a lot of work to do, but I'm the optimist. I always see the half full glass. So hopefully we can all work together to make the world a better world, a better place.
Well, that is just an amazing message. Your being with us today was just absolutely fantastic. You know, our commitment from Daniel Pearl Education Center to Holocaust education, as we talked earlier, we take kids to the United States Holocaust Memorial every year. Unfortunately, we couldn't go this year because of the pandemic, but this is something that we're very, very tuned into, and your message was just absolutely amazing. It was. I don't even know what to say. I hope that you kind of feel the standing ovation that you're getting right across the Atlantic Ocean. So, so we want to thank you so much for being with us today. We look forward to working with you in the future, and I want to thank everybody who tuned in this afternoon. And stay safe, and we hope to see you again very soon. So thanks again, Tali, and have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.